The tale starts in a gloomy forest where bare branches twist in their own pain, creating an eerie silence that makes you feel your way through the darkness. Dark leaves drift through the air beneath a cloudy, murky sky. This forest is filled with bizarre monsters that do not exist in reality. A purple monster lies over a young man and bites toward him while a knife is stabbed into the monster's neck and blood spills from the wound. The young man lies on the ground under the monster's jaws with saliva dripping over his face and says, "Damn it." The monster's huge mouth opens wide above the young man's head with rows of sharp teeth, and its tongue hanging down toward him. He drops a stream of blood and shouts that whatever happens next will stop being anything but death. A young man jolted awake, his body spinning violently against the sheets as if waking from a long night's sleep. He tightens his jaw and lets out a long, shaky breath, whispering to himself, "I've been gone 12 years now, but it hurts more than anything else." He rests his cheek against his hand while staring at the sky, whispering a final version of that long-awaited dream to himself. In that sunny day, power lines stretch across rooftops above buildings as he sits at his desk with a pen in hand, sketching a scary monster figure while writing notes for himself before rising up to face the reality of ending his life. He stood barefoot on a pile of books, staring blankly at nothing but feeling exhausted until he screamed, "Sleep is the most painful thing, and I am so damn tired." Then suddenly a monster bit into my neck while blood sprayed across his shoulder, as every time he fell asleep in reality, he was sent back to the nightmare world. As a blade slammed into his chest, a shower of red juice erupted from his bleeding wounds, and as he collapsed backwards onto the floor, shouting with rage, "If I die in this nightmare world, I'm going back to reality." He hunched on the bed, clutching a tight stomach and breathing hard, unable to get a proper night's rest. While he glares at the ceiling with tired eyes, he crouches in tall grass, wearing a hood and gripping a sword as he spends 12 years mastering weaponry, martial arts, and jungle survival to stop dying in nightmares. Struck by the sudden realization, he drives his low-hanging sword down into a monster's head where blood sprays from the impact. He stands alone in his room with one hand pressed against his temple, saying, because of his training, he now dies less often in the nightmares. He sits behind his desk with his hands folded, whispering softly, "Try to figure out what I want to do, because maybe that will finally help me fall asleep." He stared straight ahead with tense eyes as he spoke the words that meant exactly what you were thinking of. He stands in the middle of a messy room, staring up at tall shelves stacked with books and boxes, whispering that all he really wants to do is finally go back to sleeping soundly. His blood pours out of his nose and mouth in a slow stream. "Ah!" His voice cracks as he screams, then gasps for air before slamming onto the ground where a massive pool of blood has already formed around him. He lay on the floor, his cheek pressed hard against the bleeding smear on his face and chin as he gasped for air. The vast, refreshing meadow stretches beneath that bright blue sky, and when the day truly begins, a fresh gust of cold wind blows gently through the grasses, filling his chest with cool air right to his forehead, as if waking him up from sleep. And for the first time in 12 years, he feels like he actually slept well. He stood before a vast, glowing window that peeked out of the trees, wondering why the sky looked so different from where it used to be when he was alive. Through that open doorway, I look at a tree standing against a gray sky and wonder why we are here in the first place. He leans back against those huge, ancient roots beneath the towering misty trees, staring up at the dark void where his 12-year-old nightmare ended. Suddenly, he turned his head with a startled look. The massive creature, hiding behind a tree with its many eyes sticking out, lets out a long, gaping tongue and stares into the distance while the hooded man presses his hands against the sides of his own cloak. He pushed hard against the thick oak branch as darkness fell over him, and suddenly a massive gash covered his right shoulder before he even saw the blood splatter on the ground. The old man lies still in the dirt, staring at the frozen pool of blood that has pooled around him, while he rests his chin firmly against it as a giant tree's massive roots begin to pull down slowly from above. The giant roots stand tall as a wall, and when he walks through them, death feels like nothing real at all. He stares forward with wide eyes as he suddenly feels the world stop spinning around him, declaring that this place is now his real life. A giant reptilian monster stands nearby, watching you from above as you climb up toward the roots to see what lies beyond that mysterious green world. He pulls back the hood to let one eye slip down, thinking the monster is too dangerous right here, so he heads straight for where they fear most. He lowers his chin under the hood and keeps his head down, pulling a curved sword out of his waist while a sharp metallic ring echoes as he struggles to feel that strange sensation in his own chest. He jumps forward with his sword upraised as he shouts that he won't run away, while the monster stares back with wide eyes. The tall man grips the heavy sword tight beside him as he stares at himself, wondering if a deep sleep brought that strange sensation to a brand new body. A giant reptile monster charges down to meet him, and he holds his sword out as if to strike back. A gigantic monster's multi-eyed head roars as it lunges forward, its jaw gaping wide to catch the air like a vacuum, while a shower of sharp, choking spit erupts out from beneath that open mouth. His arms are clamped hard against the iron blade, and his entire body goes rigid in a scream as he presses down on it. He lowered his head under the hood with a sharp stare and told everyone he was ready to kill anyone who stopped him. The steel in his hand danced over the beast's rotting skin like a knife on paper as sharp tears of red blood escaped from its body. His cape tears open as he looks back at the monster, whose massive clawed foot crashes down with a thud that sends dust and debris flying everywhere around him. The massive creature lurched back like a rag doll, letting the fresh blood stream from the gaping hole in its chest pour down, then crumpled to the ground as it held onto the sword that was already bleeding. The towering bright pillars of light dropped down one by one from the heavens above. You have to stand still as your friend's sword drives down through that beast before they can even move their heads forward. The knife slices through the beast's stomach, and the man reaches deep inside his gloved hand to clutch away the glowing monster core before he can look down on it. He bites down hard on a glowing core, and suddenly a bright blue substance shoots out of his mouth like angry water, forcing a gash across his face while red blood wads up from his cheeks. A giant scaly monster slams its jaws down on the ground, and he wields his blade like a shield while watching this nightmare retreat into the dark woods. His crimson eyes blaze with intense focus while a thick layer of blood coats his cheeks and lips as he shouts out the terrifying truth, "I will never die again." As the main character steps away from a giant root system in the woods, he feels like stepping into an untamed adventure waiting for his next move. The sun pours through the canopy, casting bright beams that land right at your feet. You look up and see someone staring straight ahead with a serious expression. He sits perfectly still on a thick tree branch, his sword resting across his shoulder as the golden light filters gently through the leaves. He pauses in mid-sentence and lets out a long exhale, letting the quiet laughter of those who came before wash over him as he finally opens his wide, welcoming eyes again. The man stretched out his arm, letting the relaxed smile spread across his face as he whispered, "It's another good night of rest." The leaves keep drifting down through the air as if they were waiting for someone else to catch them in their fall. He swung his curved blade across the vines one long month after stepping across the bridge. He looks down beneath his hood, explaining that even while moving through the pitch-black darkness toward light, fighting now isn't enough to mean hunting. He reflects that risking life for fun is madness. As a bat-like monster feeding on a corpse in the forest, he watches from behind a large tree and admits he can't help feeling the urge to fight. He lowers his voice and says, "The only time we hunt is when we need food. Then I realize I'm getting hungry." In a burst of speed, he swung his sharp weapon and sliced through the beast. As the creature lurched, a glowing blue heart bloomed within its form. Then, the hero's blade bit deep into that pulsing red center, sending a wave of blood through the flesh as it cried out in agony. He wipes his mouth as he whispers to the crowd, "Now you can finally use your new monster powers." He's leaning back against the trees while staring into space as if time has stopped, wondering how long he's been able to get used to living here after starting to eat it. He grabs his belt and remembers a new secret. As he pulls a metal token from his pocket, he instantly knows that this thing belongs to a third-aid mercenary who has magic, so he watches carefully as the engraving spells catch his eye. The word third-class mercenary tangles around the cord as he thinks of it echoing back in his head. His eyes widen as he zooms in on the detail. He sits right next to the trees and watches, wondering why those tiny tokens suggest we are all just waiting for someone else to live up to our potential. The sun pours bright rays through the leaves in front of him, and he shouts with delight that he can actually see it. As he slowly turns his head to look around, his surprised face shows him just one more thing before they decide if it's fine or not. He stands with his back to the dirt as a giant metal beast slides down the hill, its jagged jaws wide open in an act of pure surprise. He slowly turns his head, eyes wide with a tense look, and suddenly snaps his mouth open to reveal the words behind him mean nothing. His cloak trails behind him as he leaps through the woods and whispers that something could be hiding out there. The sun hits the leaves like golden honey as they catch the morning light. The tall man pauses at the edge of the field before his little wooden cottage, watching it from across the clear grass. As his wide eyes darted upward, the words escaped him like a secret he was about to share. "It's a house." He slammed his fist against the wood and let the wooden door swing open while he waited to see who would show up. He stands deep within that cozy house, watching as a solitary book sits quietly on the table nearby. He reaches out with gloved fingers and places them atop the open book before speaking. This is something. The protagonist now holds it wide with both hands, looking down at its pages to say, "It is called Demonic Realm Chronicles," as his eyes widen in surprise. He leaned forward as he opened the thick book and said, "This place and how we talk about it has been recorded very carefully," while his eyes met someone's stare and demanded, "To survive here, you need this." Suddenly, a hard boot slammed onto the wooden floor, creating a loud thud and shattering silence. He steps out of the shadows holding a heavy crossbow pointed directly at his chest as someone shouts over the noise that his answer was not there yet. He kept the crossbow pointed straight ahead, shouting out the words clearly so the man wouldn't miss him. His eyes drifted to the side with that soft, tired grin, wondering just how it felt seeing someone else who might just be mistaken for a bad guy. The old man stood up slowly as the gun pointed straight at his heart, but the narrator kept his mouth shut so the story didn't get lost in the shouting match. The older man stares ahead at his guest and shouts, "You have no place here," as the protagonist sits by the table with a book on it, nodding silently that he truly gets it. His gloved hand presses down on the book's cover while he talks about the story. The protagonist grips his book tightly between his arms, whispering urgently to someone else, "Could you lend me this one? I'm begging for just one more copy." The old man stared hard at the screen and asked, "What if I refuse?" He stares forward with a tight, tense face while pulling out his dagger, knowing the moment comes when his cloak shimmers and he answers, "If so, I'll turn into a thief." He grips his dagger tightly as he stares into the old man's eyes, watching him fire the crossbow to threaten him. He stares down the crossbow at the target, his eyes locked in focus as he aims for nothing but silence and power. The protagonist narrowed his eyes, whispering that he couldn't tell if the old man was truly as powerful as it looked, yet he knew he wouldn't fail. As the old man's mustache begins to move slowly, his gentle smile grows fainter and more peaceful. Hector steps through the door, holding a crossbow down by his side, and tells everyone that a robber wouldn't dare speak of reading a book. Kim Woo-jin stepped forward with eyes that held sharp focus as the man lowered his guard and introduced himself. Heavier than he seems, Hector lets go of the crossbow before he can speak again and rubs his face as if it were just a good morning greeting. Ju Jai is quite a peculiar name. Jean watches from behind him, wondering how to call that strange name. Jean looks puzzled as the gloved hand gently covers his face, holding on tightly to the thick book while Hector explains that Jean can stay for a bit to read it, and Hector promises to handle some small chores in return. A quiet little wooden cabin stands behind its iron fence as mist drifts gently past the green trees. A pot of soup boils over a small fire, letting vegetable bits drift into the broth while Jean stays behind at Hector's door. Hector isn't as tough-looking as he appears to be. He just seems gruff. Hector is sipping his bowl while Jean looks ready to take his meal away. Jean's eyes are fixed on that bowl of hot soup as he pulls back from the table, making his face light with a sad smile because he can't find anything warm to share. He picks up a small bowl of soup, puts it in his mouth, and immediately lets out a gasp for air, realizing the taste must be amazing. As the sky opened up early in the morning, Hector pulled his gun into his pack to chase the wolves away, while Jean stayed home with her mug ready for a coffee break. Hector stares blankly at the horizon as he whispers, "I'm going to smash that monster right here." Hector stares up at Jean as he prepares to eat dinner, feeling incredibly worried because the stranger claims he's stronger than anyone else in this room. The door opens wide, and Jean watches as Hector steps out, clutching a heavy crossbow and armor, ready for battle. Jean finds his solitude beautiful when he sits by the table, carefully reading those old chronicles. The Northern Empire began its story when a massive stone fortress roared to life on a jagged cliffside, and thousands of soldiers, armed with high-stakes spears, watched in awe from the shadows below. The mighty king of the Northern Empire, blinded by greed, dives deep into an endless wall of light and dreams. He stepped through a gate that felt like stepping into another realm, where a beam of crimson light showered down upon him, as if holding the secrets of everything he had ever known or created. That day started with thousands of glowing eyes popping out from inside a scary darkness. The mighty monsters burst forth from that mysterious otherworldly gate, spreading their dark powers across the land as it turns into a dangerous demonic realm. In just 9 years, humanity gathers many different groups to join forces and create an alliance, which then builds a wall to keep out this evil spread. Jean gently closed the open book on the table before he could turn the page, letting the silence settle as his fingers tightened in his pocket. He leans back with his head resting on his hand, whispering thoughts to himself about valuable secrets. Yet he can't help but find something still upsetting inside him. Jean sits at the table holding a book and whispers to himself about how deep going makes things worse. Then he thinks whether those strong monsters have actually gotten weaker by moving closer to the light. Heavier than he looks, Hector pulls the heavy crossbow taut and charges forward, letting the gust of wind whip through his hair as he sprints across the grass. He pauses his breath, holding the key to his own throat close against his lips as he stares ahead, completely lost in the mystery of what lurks deeper into that cursed place. He runs toward the light, his breath hot and wild as he zips through the air, while Jean watches from behind, wondering if Hector can really push that hard. A pack of fierce, bee-sized wolves charges forward through the woods as a massive, glowing red-eyed wolf in front leaps into action. Hector dives low and tight, pulling the crossbow tight against his chest before a giant white wolf soars past him with jaws wide open. The leather of Hector's boots vibrates loudly when he snaps his fingers to brace himself for impact. The boy stepped back and unleashed a volley of bolts while arrows flew down like a storm toward the monsters. A hail of bolts slammed into charging wolves like lightning, knocking one back onto its side and spurring a second creature to sprint ahead with renewed energy. The wolf, whose glowing red eyes spark like the moon, shudders and hissing while a jagged slice of light splits its throat right before he can even blink. Hector shakes his head and bursts into a loud, angry yell. Hector is sprinting toward home as Jean bursts through the door, carrying a deadly rifle. The tall Jean strides forward, gripping the massive sword firmly in his left hand as a single eye flashes brilliant red against the dark background. Hector dives straight for Jean while raising his bow to stop the guard, but Jean lunges hard into Hector's chest before running past him. Hector stares back at the horizon with wide, watery eyes and a sudden surge of adrenaline flooding his face like warm honey. Jean's bright red eye glows as wind streaks past his face before he rushes forward, but then he leaps from the ground with a sharp impact. Meanwhile, Jean descends from above while the blade is held high. A massive white wolf rears up with its jaws and claws spread wide, staring directly at him. The genetic weapon cuts through the wolf with surgical precision, sending a massive shower of red blood across its cold, wet form. The heavy blade slices through the beast's neck as Jean delivers his final blow, sending a massive block of flesh flying into the dirt before the powerful creature collapses to the ground behind him. The guy stared out at the open field like he was holding an egg, droplets of sweat sliding down his forehead while the wind whipped through his hair. He shouted, "Oh my God!" as Jean held his sword aloft to block the blood spraying from the werewolf's wounds. Hector yelled back that had been a swift, clean strike to the face. A giant werewolf slams into the earth, tearing a hole so wide that his whole body bursts through and spews thousands of drops of red blood onto the floor below him. Jean yelled after Hector, who froze and stared down at the gun he was holding with a wide-eyed shock. The giant monster glares at Jean as his own blood splatters onto his own cheek, making him ask, "Is that even a monster?" Hector stares at the man in front of him and wonders aloud, "Are you really saying that this werewolf is strong?" Hector narrowed his eyes as he replied, "It's incredibly strong." Jean watches the pack of wolves stare him down with a cool, sharp look as his hand rests on his sword hilt, knowing that he will listen to everything afterward after handling them all. The pack of wolves stood tall and proud in the thick woods, their sharp teeth gleaming under the bright sun as they waited for game to arrive. Jean grips the handle of his knife while staring into those piercing, pulsating blue eyes. He knows with a terrifying certainty that these 40 individuals will easily sever his neck or crush his mind if they do not act quickly and firmly this moment. He lets out a low hum and tightens his grip on the sword, slashing through the group before reaching for the leader who stands in the center like a giant statue. "Don't fight everyone," he whispers, then turns to slice through that figure's throat and shatter their spirits. The wolves gathered around the massive pack member, who immediately recognized the incoming threat, and Jin's sharp gaze locked onto them before she could move to help. Jean glances up with his eyes glowing bright red, while spinning a weapon that hums with power above his head, clearly signaling this is the final target he must destroy. The brown wolf howls loudly as he grinds his sharp teeth against the ground below. Jin's narrowed red eye went straight for the big brown wolf with all its might. A gray wolf sees the other one dying, so it runs away screaming as the big wolf stops to look confused and scared by what just happened. Suddenly, a blinding gust of wind whips through the woods like an angry storm, snapping branches from trees and sending flying leaves everywhere, while the wolves shudder and freeze in terror inside their den. Jean grips his mighty sword as his pack of wolves shivers and scrambles to flee before they can reach him. Hector stared with wide eyes, completely stunned as the pack of fierce wolves suddenly vanished from sight. Jean sits quietly as he watches the wolf carefully take note of what happens next. The big brown wolf scurries across the pine trees as a storm rolls in and threatens to swallow them all before they even reach their feet. A weathered wooden building sits quietly beneath the heavy, blackening clouds of a storm. Hector stood in the living room, watching as the corpse of the wolf lay stretched out on the table, while he recounted how many golden coins had been stolen from his friend who killed him. Jean reaches out his hand toward the body and wonders if collecting that much cash would be enough to pay for everything he's been carrying. Hector replies, "It seems quite large indeed." Jean stammers in surprise, while Hector finishes his sentence about living like a ghost without the grind of 6 to 7 years. Jean stares back at that imposing beast just as it roars into existence. He wonders aloud why such a weak creature would earn this massive reward. But then he thinks so hard, and suddenly a tiny, shy smile spreads across his features. A faint smirk plays on Jean's lips as she remembers how easy it is to just hunt down monsters for her own money while living in these strange lands. She wonders if all those tough choices and hardships of the past have really made life here any less difficult. Hector carefully spreads a small pouch full of cash, fresh jerky, and an unfinished map onto the wolf's furry coat before letting them eat it all. Jean sits beside the corpse while Hector watches him read over the wolf's fur. They stand together near the map as Hector guides Jean toward Pioneer Village, where he looks for Jacob marked on a spot. A tangle of gold coins falls from the pocket like a falling star when Jean watches Hector's wolf paw twitch, asking with a grin how much he really wants to take. Hector watched Jean's face as he stepped forward, declaring that killing the beast was his only choice to pay off a long-standing grudge toward it. Hector reaches out with a steady hand, as if he's ready to help someone else. He grabs Jean's hand to thank him for his victory, hoping to see them when luck finally picks up. The two of them held hands tightly, so close their knuckles were almost touching. Jean squeezed Hector's arm in a huge hug because he had done all the heavy lifting and thanked him bravely for it. A tiny wooden cabin sits peacefully by the forest's edge. Jean steps out of the living room with his arms crossed while Hector watches from the door as he carries his own heavy bag. Jean steps onto the forest trail while carrying a heavy leather pack strapped to him by the side and another bag dangling from his shoulder, ready for whatever adventure awaits beneath the trees. As he strolls along, he shifts his gaze toward the distant formation where a small, shadowy beast rests atop a boulder. The towering beast stands atop the rocky ledge, raising its massive head to let out a deep, ominous roar as its piercing blue eyes glow brightly. Jean hops onto the porch of his friend's house, watching his armed guards stand guard over him and begin to enter Pioneer Village. Jean watches from the gate as the guards stand ready, noting that this small settlement offers plenty of food and supplies for travelers coming in. A few townspeople stop in a hurry and look down at Jean as he trots along the winding street, clutching his little bundle beside him. The tall stranger walks past the muscular man in his own space, watching as other men gather behind him to spy on him like a group of people on high alert who haven't met yet. It's not about how much you're scared. It's just how scary things get when they look at us from behind a thick coat of fur. People stand along the street watching Jean walk away with a large pelt on his back, and it becomes clear that in a world like this, the thing more dangerous than monsters can be people. A wooden tavern sign hanging above the door looks like a welcome station for everyone coming in. Jean steps into the tavern, pulling off his worn sack as guests lounge at their own tables while a waitress brings fresh cups for everyone. Jean walked by, and dozens of men stopped in their tracks as they all looked at his legs. The bartender steps aside so Jean can grab his big rolled pelt and heavy sack from the counter, letting his friend watch him with a grin while he takes the drink out of hand. Jean stares down the bar, smiling as he tells the bartender to drop his drink, then wonders exactly where he can find a man named Jacob while someone else is already looking around. A man grabs a knife and a slice of bread, declaring himself Jacob, when a stranger hears his name and immediately spots how scarred he looks like an accomplice to someone else. He stepped back just enough to see the world shrink around him, his voice dropping low as he whispered, "Hector said I can get this wolf skin for free if we meet." Jacob's back snaps in a jolt of pure fear as the blade flies free, leaving Jean to press his forehead against the wet fur of a dead wolf on the table, while he erupts into a confused shout about what happened to the beast. Jacob grabbed the big leather roll and pulled it tight as Jean watched, noting that he knew Hector had been the wolf's killer and decided not to push back. He stares down the wolf's fur on the table with wide eyes and declares it's definitely a real one. Many men gather around to watch as Jacob holds the leather of a horse, while another man confidently declares Hector might have finally accomplished this feat, adding with confidence that even if Hector is now older, he will remain exactly who he was before. Jacob's wide grin curls around his mouth just as he whispers, making sure everyone knows what to expect next. He turned his back, gripping the edge of his sword so hard his knuckles turned white, and said, "I know Hector could pull this off." A group of men swarm Jean as he freezes mid-stutter, the air thick with tension from their sudden grip on a sharp knife and clenched fists. He jerks his head quickly around and stammers, asking what they are really doing. Jacob shoves a wolfskin hat on his own head and points his clawed hand at Jean, whispering about the danger before gently offering him a chance to escape and sparing him from death. Jacob stares at Jean as he calls him a liar, wondering why that particular guy knew exactly how to make things go wrong before any real deal happened. Jacob tilts his head with a wicked grin as he whispers to Jean, telling him that Hector was so far away it had caused a loss for everyone involved. Jacob lifted that werewolf paw over his shoulder with a grin, whispering, "I need this fur to make up for all the mistakes I've made." Jean watches the man's face turn cold while his glowing red eyes stare ahead, wondering if killing him is actually the right move before he decides otherwise. He leans heavily against the chair while he explains that killing someone isn't worth their skin, then slurs the man in his face like a bad joke. Jacob grabs a beer and hurries over to Jinx when his face turns red from the splash. Jacob stands with an empty mug right next to his mouth, looking over at Jean with a smirk, because he knows that getting lost is actually smarter than trying to act like you can do tricks just for fun. The quiet room holds the air still, but Jean's back turns inward as a cascade of dark beer spills from his coat, leaving only his head exposed in that empty space. Jean walks out of the bar, letting his empty mug fall to the floor while Jacob holds onto it, watching his armed men surround him with ready-to-use knives in their grasp. Jacob grins as he holds the heavy sack over his shoulder and says, "That's a great idea," to Jean. Jacob's face goes rigid as he stumbles over his words in confusion. Jean lifts the heavy wooden table high above him like a giant superhero, letting the wood slide up while he lets go of it. He pulls back from standing in the corner and shouts, "Jacob," to break the silence in the dark hallway. The red-eyed Jean turned his head and said, "If you're trying to cheat out of the beginning, aim for the neck instead of the back." Jacob's wide eyes peek out from under his wolf mask as he lets out a sharp breath, clearly realizing that Jean is actually quite clever. A pack of tough guys sprinting toward the door with guns drawn, while a young boy stands silently behind him, whispering to himself that he doesn't even know how much precious this moment is worth. As the sky turns red and his breath hitches in his throat, he swings his massive sword like a thunderbolt down toward Jean, screaming for him to die as the wind howls through the dark forest. Asterisk, his cloak whipped around him as he burst forward, his glowing red eyes locking onto the crowd before shouting, "People who are so mean wouldn't hurt anyone anyway." A sharp blade flies down with a thunderous crash, sending Jean's shadow fall low beneath the impact. The attacker grabs both swords and rumbles a roar about Jean being tough and quick before he swings the blade high into the air to catch the next target's move. He lowered his eyes and gave the cold expression he wore before. A sword slash cuts through the crowd of attackers, sending a shower of blood flying to the ground where two men tumble around as they try to get out of harm's way. The bald man grabs the big gun in his hand and jerks it straight at Jean's face. The gun crashes down hard, sending a cloud of dust flying up while Jean watches from behind like he's watching a game show. His knee buckles against the wood, pushing the table forward with surprising strength. The table slides across the floor right as the bald attacker turns around, sending everyone flying sideways in a chaotic explosion of motion. The bald man instinctively pushed back his chair as he heard a sudden crash and saw the overturned table fall from the corner of the room. Jean felt a cold slice of metal cut through her shoulder as the blade descended sharply against the sky above. Giant Jean leaps up into the air and slices a piece of the ceiling straight down while a shower of mist and dust explodes out from his blade. He stands perfectly still, and a thin line of dark blood runs down the side of his face while his bright red eyes lock onto something ahead. As Jacob stared out the window with wide eyes, he felt his breath catch in his throat because a massive, shadowy figure was suddenly standing right there in the street, causing him to gasp as he tried to understand what had happened. The injured man lies idle while the enemy swarm pulls up rifles to target him, and Jacob wonders if his lack of experience has cost him all the glory they've won so far. Jean dives beneath the attack with his arm crossed, while the attacker grabs onto his legs as he tries to lift him off ground. Jean slammed his hand onto the man's chest with such force that his own arm jerked out of place immediately after. A sudden rush of blood erupts as Jean drives his hand down into a stranger's gut to hurt him. The air shakes as a blade cuts through the sky with a sharp sweep. He swings a blade through a giant bald man's chest while bright red ink splatters all over the sacred altar where he holds the weapon. Jean stands tall over a dead man who has his glowing red eyes staring down him as he lies motionless on the ground. The tired guy with the bloody cheek stares at the ceiling, holding his breath while that single, burning red eye lights up the room in a strange, wild way. A terrified Jacob yells that everyone must flee, and two men sprinting through the wooden door look back at him in alarm as they rush into the dark room. He leaps out of a wooden wall, scattering shattered glass and broken pieces of wood as he flies into the open air. Jacob lies sprawled out on the dirt, eyes wide open in a scream of pure terror as he stares straight ahead. His wide eyes filled with terror as he stared straight ahead and screamed into the void of shock. A mighty giant red wolf with dazzling blue eyes stands mid-shout, mouth wide open and teeth bared like a warning bell, demanding to know exactly why so strange monsters are living in this little village. Jacob dives down the stairs as he sees Jean approaching, his heart pounding as he raises his sword to defend himself from a sudden threat. A red wolf stares intensely at Jean as dozens of villagers lean into the scene behind him, their fingers flying open in a collective wall of fearful dread. The wolf is staring intently at Jean, and suddenly he lets out a loud bark. His teeth show, and saliva shoots from his mouth, startling Jin, who turns to investigate. The jaguar's crimson eye pulses wildly as he confronts the beast, shouting in a desperate plea, "Come back. I want you gone." And just then, the creature stops mid-step, its head snapping forward with jaw-tight muscles like a frozen stone. The wolf jumps down onto the grass and huddles tight, whimpering softly as it rests its head against Jean's shoulder to rest his body. Jean stares at the sleeping red wolf as it struggles to stand up from a lie-flat position right behind him. Three angry attackers look confused as they point wildly at a terrified wolf. Jean squinted as he watched the wolf act strangely, wondering why it was behaving that way. The mighty wolf froze in the dark as it looked up at the sky, its wide eyes filled with a storm of sweat and exhaustion while his tongue slowly pulled back from its mouth. As Jean pointed a finger at the three attackers who were suddenly terrified, he watched helplessly as the wolf sat right beside them, waiting for anything to move. The wolf spots Jean's finger right in front of its mouth and immediately yells, "Bit!" as Jean stands ready for battle. The wolf steps up, its glowing eyes blazing bright as the stars. A fierce wolf charges forward while the terrified man flails his arms in a desperate struggle for life. As a fierce wolf crashes headlong onto the farmer, smashing his body hard against the dirt while his blood tears through the air, screaming in agony. Jean watches the attack and shouts a "nice" as Jacob stumbles back into his chair, staring intensely at the wolf for a long moment. A wolf snatches from a dead man's hand as he slumps to the dirt, with another body lying nearby. Jacob groaned loudly while his eyes widened in shock at the news that he needed to leave right away. Jean looks at the sky calm, then Jacob kneels before him, raises both hands in prayer, and begs for mercy before offering everything he's told. Jacob drops his chin down as he grinds his teeth together and whispers, "Revenge will be here soon." Jacob's hand reached out for Jint's blade, and it sliced straight through the earth right next to his palm as he watched it fall away. Jacob snaps his head back like a startled cat, revealing the sudden flow of red juice running down his face. The knight leans in close to the fallen soldier, who watches nervously as his companion whispers, "Sir," before pulling back from the sword handle to reveal a grim expression on his face. Jean looks straight ahead with those intense, glowing red eyes and speaks softly, "I'm not the kind you take lightly." A happy man in a small office room sits across from him, saying, "I am sorry and I'd like to let you go." Jean sat alone by the desk as the factory manager explained why the missing salary hadn't been paid yet. Jean sits in the office with that forced smile, telling everyone back then he was too soft-hearted to fight for anything but accepting the odds. Then, as days passed, the calendar's pages tear apart, and he says his week-long delay is now delayed by a full month. Meanwhile, Jean walks in and raises an arm, shouting that this month's salary is also late, while the factory manager swings a golf club toward him. The manager leans back his chair and whispers, "You're the most punk thing I've ever seen." The manager yelled at the crowd to stay united during hard times, calling the kids selfish, while Jean mocked him for treating them like weaklings. Jean stood right next to his weapon, a tall Jacob who was standing on top of it, and Jean said, "Oh, I'm so sorry for living all month long." He turned his head sharply and whispered that Jacob had only one lesson to learn before they left. Jacob's eyes darted wide as he slowly lifted his head, and a tight grin spread across his face just as the sun dipped low behind him. The boy's face wrinkles into a jagged, twisted grin as he leans forward in the crowd, ready to take his next bold step. It was a violent moment as he flailed his arms wildly, grabbing the sharp blade fast enough to cut him in half before he even had time to stop. Jean screamed as he watched him leap up from behind him, his hand still holding the dagger high in the air. He glances up at the stars while a hand shoots into the air. Gene moves his hand in a guard block while Jacob draws his sword and lowers it sharply to meet the impact. Gene roared as he drew his sword, shouting that those scammers won't even understand how regretful they truly are. The frozen jaw of Jacob shatters into a terrifying grin as the storm outside snaps shut over him. When Jin's blade slices through him like a knife, a shower of glittering blood erupts from the wound, sending chaos swirling around him in that chaotic moment. Jacob's broken head spins in midair as a torrent of blood shoots out like a storm cloud, leaving behind a trail of crimson dust that freezes the night before it can wash away. As Gene lowered his heavy head, while the glow of his crimson eyes burned on the fabric around him, he warned everyone that they would not be pushed over again in this fight. The quiet room suddenly cracks as Gene rises over the corpse, letting the crimson blood splash out like rain against the floor. Gene shifted his gaze toward the beast, realizing suddenly a massive pack had appeared before him with a tiny pouch dangling from its jaws as he began to speak again. He lowered his head gently and dropped the bag right in front of himself, then laughed aloud as it clicked loudly upon impact. It looks like he's already decided to chase after me forever. The heavy bag lay flat on the grass, and a few shiny gold coins spilled out inside. He glances down at the sword as he pulls it back into her sheath with a quick motion. Gene stepped forward with a grin, pointing his hand toward the hunched beast standing there, asking if he could be one of their friends when they finally got home. As Gene stepped forward, he gently placed his trembling hand on Wolf's head. His gloved fingers gently brush the wolf's head while it lets out a deep sigh of surprise and closes its own closed eyes. Gene steps forward and lets out a soft laugh as he sees the wolf's eyes narrow into something fierce before glancing back at him with that same faint smile. Gene stood by the big wolf and said, "That's a clever trick," as he stroked his own head in a quiet moment of connection. Rows of red brick buildings stretch out like a long curtain across the floor, nestled right under a massive stone fortification and a sturdy wooden watchtower that guards the city above. Soft light spills through the open sky over those drifting clouds. Gene sits up in bed inside a room while the horned wolf lies asleep on the floor beside an empty bowl. A faint smile forms on Jin's lips as he says it was a perfect, deep sleep, and the wolf stretches wide while Gene raises his hand beside the bed to say that morning feels so refreshing. He feels like he could fly. Gene sits shirtless on a wooden stool beside a stream, washing his clothes in a large basin while water drips from Jin's arm. He wipes his face, exhales, and tells them that for the first time he killed someone because it was not just one or two people, but many. Gene rests his chin low as he looks down at his hands and whispers, "But I don't even think about feeling guilty," as water cascaded over his face while he lowered his head to speak. Because they were so much scum, the realization hit him that what he was saying wasn't just about the dirty mess, but a feeling of something far more dangerous and terrifying behind those words. He felt exactly the thrill of killing people alongside how much fun hunting monsters gave him, and every time he swung his blade with that wide grin, it made his heart skip a beat. As he pressed his hand tightly to the side of his own chest, a gentle buzz vibrated through him like a whisper in the wind. He lowered his head and studied his hand as he slowly realized that something new was starting to grow in his chest. His crimson pupils seemed to twinkle faintly, and as a sudden thought strikes him that he may have been cursed, he quickly decides to endure whatever fate lies ahead. Gene steps through the forest where the big wolf stands guard, whispering that his future here is entirely new, filled with plenty rather than empty hours. As a quiet smile forms beneath his hood, he lets go of worries and truly enjoys the moment now. The wolf leads the massive fortress of the 5th Pioneer City and shouts, "We must sell the pelt right away." He walked by, rubbing his temples as he told the wolf to stay close so he could hide away from danger. The town's main street in Pioneer City buzzes with noise and crowds, but all that attention is momentarily lost when the lone figure steps onto the sidewalk, holding a massive, heavy-rolled pelt over his shoulder as he strides purposefully toward the Order Alliance to claim a monster bounty. He pauses to remember how the story says another part of the Order has come from the city of Pioneer before he looks back at where it started. The towering stone tower suddenly pops up from behind the Order Alliance's office window while a clerk lazily stretches out his hands, eyes rolling back on the balcony ledge before finally falling asleep. Gene leans against the counter, resting a heavy rolled pelt on his shoulders as he looks toward the door. The clerk steps forward, pointing out that this is indeed the Order Alliance, but Gene has no other choice. He turns to ask what's pulling him here today. Gene slides a big rolled-up coat across the desk, and the clerk's face goes wide with shock. Gene walked into the lobby where a man named Clerk stood with his hands on his hips. "I come to collect," Gene said, looking around as if expecting something else behind him. The clerk grabbed the leather bag and looked down at it with a scowl, insisting that it was merely dog skin and no time would be wasted for any pranks. His eyes widened as he leaned in so close that suddenly he told them to wait. He grabbed the wolf skin and yelled it was a pelt while Jean stood by the counter watching him carefully. Sweat slicked down the clerk's cheeks as he watched Jean try to stop him from catching the pelt. Jean looked at him and said, "I heard you spoke before." Jean sits alone at the far end of the long wooden table within this vast hall. He stepped into the room holding his bag and made a quick apology to make everyone feel comfortable before he could start his serious mission about verifying that this animal really existed. As the werewolf's wolf skin was finally verified genuine, he handed over a heavy coin pouch to the host for the prize. Jean clutches the shiny pouch tightly in his palms, letting a heavy sigh roll out of his chest as he checks if the cash he just found is truly worth living on for another 6 or 7 years. A sudden tremor shakes him as he pulls out a handful of shiny gold coins, feeling suddenly like someone else is chasing them with a new kind of fear. He lets out a big grin and watches coins pour over his hand as he figures out that cash makes all the difference. He turns his head toward the whispering voice and replies with a puzzled gaze, asking if that extra question is really what he wants to hear before he gives it up for the sake of the deal. Jean steps closer, her face lighting up with a soft smile as she asks for something. He rubbed his forehead as he told everyone about the scary beast that had just come out of the quarry, leaving people worried for all of us. The miners stand frozen in the dark tunnel, their eyes wide with fear as a monstrous eye pierces the gloom outside, because monsters are blocking out the light and the very world they love is about to collapse under its weight. A small boy sprawls on the dirt while a man pulls up a heavy liquor bottle, all because someone claims a monstrous creature is bigger than a werewolf. And that's exactly what the guy thinks about telling his friend about it. Jean steps forward, eyes wide as he stares hard into the man's face, and says, "Well, this thing looks like a giant monster." He describes a terrifying monster like a huge skull, who has blazing red eyes and holds 70 golden coins for him to take away. Jean slowly turns his head toward a memory that feels like a ghostly whisper of Mad Skull from the Chronicles book. The shadow of a massive, bone-chested monster hangs heavy over Jean as he swings his weapon at its looming face, recalling the fierce battle he just endured and staring down the threat. The Mad Skull stares with a hard, bony face, while its burning crimson eyes glow with intense hunger. The creature's intense, pulsating glow bites down through the gloom, forcing a beast of impossible fury to appear in the shadow, utterly outshining any ordinary wolf. He stretched wide as he recalled how long it took him to wipe away his last blood stain after only surviving 28 failed attempts. The man crosses the table in a way that makes Jean wonder why he's not scared of the beast yet. As Jean tilts his head slightly, he keeps his mouth shut completely. As his glowing red eyes light up and he replies, "Of course." The vast rock landscape unfolds below, featuring towering cliffs, active mining facilities, and a shadowy cavern that dominates the scene. The old man strolls down the winding stone path near the quarry, whispering that his friends couldn't work yet because he's been too busy staring at his own weird head. He stands right at the opening of the quarry and stares intently into the darkness, wondering if he should rush straight back in or wait for someone else to come along first. A quiet walk begins when Jean steps onto a gravel path beside a heavy quarry where a worker has been waiting in his chair for ages, calling out urgently to make sure he stays put before he moves on. Jean stood behind a line of brave men who had just stepped up to the front, shouting that they had already won and wanted everyone's applause before he could even move. The red-haired mercenary laughs awkwardly as Jean suddenly snaps back toward the group, instantly realizing he's been asked to leave just because they're ahead of everyone else. He wonders ever since monsters had to wait in line before getting their turn. Jonathan spread his arms wide as he pointed to Jean and told him the news. They might want to team up and work together on a big hunt. Jean pauses, staring off at the horizon as he considers if he should wait until the mercenaries finish their mission before stepping forward himself. Jonathan beams with confidence and offers his hand, ready to say that teamwork always wins. Jacob stands still as sweat dries down his face like a heavy blanket while Jean watches him from behind. The boy grips the edge of his blade as he shouts that he can't really rely on the crowd trying to stop him, since they're not exactly what he's expecting. The awkwardness in Jonathan's eyes makes him scratch the back of his head as he admits that being safe means more than finishing a job well. Jonathan takes a deep breath as he steps into the room, smiling confidently at Jean, ready to tell him that joining them will surely save the day. Jean pauses for a second, looking at the question in Jonathan's eyes before turning back toward the door to ask why Jonathan suspects that he is stronger than anyone else. Standing in front of Jean, Jonathan tells them clearly, The wolf won't chase me unless you're actually as tough as I am. The blonde lady stands over the mountain, holding tight the wolf's head so its teeth can lick her face. Wolves are naturally independent creatures that often follow humans after they have been taken away. Jean stares ahead with wide eyes, imagining how his secret plan worked out when he told Mutt to stay hidden. The wolf slowly lowers its head and devours a roasted piece of meat from the ground while a blonde woman kneels beside it. Smiling as Jean explains they offered him this world's cuisine that he has never tasted. A fierce wolf bites down on a roast of meat and keeps its eyes locked straight ahead, silent as the meal goes to rest. It was a hot day, and the big roast of beef with the bone rolled smoothly like a friendly dog across the grass. Jean and Jonathan wait with bated breath as a juicy roast of meat lands right in their face, ready to be eaten. The wolf barks forward at a tense face, thinking about what to do next. A shiny roast of meat sits scattered across the dirt like a spilled golden treasure, dripping in every direction as the sun beats down on it. As sweat glistens on Jin's cheeks while he stutters his words, a deep sense of bewilderment fills the air around him. He leans in close to the steak by his foot and wonders what makes his body feel so alive when he tries to recall that rare meal from years ago. Jean widened his wide eyes in moment of truth as he suddenly thought, with a look of horror, that a furry beast was actually devouring the piece of meat right there on the grass. The blonde woman laughs as she extends a warm, seasoned piece of roast over Jean's plate to fill him up. Jean looks ahead with wide eyes and murmurs quietly in the quiet air. A beautiful woman in golden hair stood smiling while clutching roasted meat. The sky was filled with bright, shimmering light around her, making it look like she was a goddess he trusted. The long ropes of metal lights cast a warm glow across the rough, dark stone walls of this ancient mining hole. Jean and Jonathan are trailing after a crowd of travelers as they step further down the long, dark mine tunnels, passing by old wooden cartwheels that seem to whisper secrets along their path. Jean holds the roasted meat in his mouth and savors the scent, feeling like he's finally had all the fun. As Claire looked up at Jean again, she paused mid-sentence to say, "We haven't talked about this before yet." The Black Marlin captain, Jonathan, grabs his own hand in a confident gesture and immediately tells Claire, "This is me," before pointing to himself with a grin. Jean stood behind the group, whispering to them about his identity before correcting himself once more, and then said, "I am Jean," before turning to Jonathan, who asked for a chance to speak freely whenever they wanted. Jonathan blinked with wide eyes at the sudden silence before his voice erupted. "They've arrived." He explained immediately that this was exactly where the battle would take place against Mad Skull. The massive cavern hummed with activity as mercenaries stretched across its rim, while Jonathan ordered the trap team to lash out and the spearmen to position themselves for battle. Jonathan steps forward as he holds the back of his head and asks Claire if they should start. She replies, "Yes." As Jean looks up with wide eyes, his glowing feathers dance beautifully in the air around him like floating stars and fireflies. Claire floats free, clutching a blank page while swirling green magic and feathers dance about her, as Jean stammers to see if it's really magic. Claire gestures to that magical circle appearing right above the open book while Jean awakens from doubt, knowing exactly what she's describing. Claire shuts her eyes and begins singing a prayer of thanks as she calls on the earth for good luck. He steps forward with that confident grin, letting the green magic and swirling feathers dance around his feet while their step triggers. He looked over at the screen with a big grin and shouted that Claire has all those cool buffs for sure. Jonathan jumps off the track with his arms up, watching a stream of green magic swirl behind him as Claire warns him it's only 3 minutes before time runs out. The boots hit the floor and a swirl of green magic danced around him, making him sound like a perfect soldier for the mission ahead. With wide arms spread out for leverage, Jonathan dashes toward the shadows where a dark figure waits, yelling loudly to draw Mad Skull into his sight. Jonathan hops over the wall, so quickly Jean almost misses his hand before he can even see what's happening. Claire watches the white feathers flutter by with a calm smile, wondering if she could even summon magic herself if she had first learned to fly. The mercenary swings his weapon low as he screams for seconds, thinking desperately about dodging the skull when suddenly another shadow appears right behind him. As Jonathan dives down the dark cave floor, a deep voice rumbles inside his head. If anyone slips, or even one person makes a mistake, they could all die. The darkness thickens around him as he pulls the heavy ropes taut across the abyss to keep everyone on guard. Jean grips the spear tight and stares forward, realizing he's planning to push that monster straight into its own trap by blasting it with all his firepower. Mad Skull eyes the wall of glass as Jean stares ahead with a sharp look, wondering if their plan will actually catch him off guard. He pounds forward like a forceful cannonball, while the air fills with the buzzing hum of green magic as a horned beast roars its way up, charging straight for his face. Jonathan looks up and yells loudly to call out the trap team. Suddenly, a giant horned monster rushes toward the scene as Jonathan dives into the air. Then, two armed men grab onto the ropes and cheer, saying he found and saw the monster called Mad Skull. The giant monster lets out a loud roar while the nets drop and tighten tightly all around its body. The giant beast slumped like a rock onto the net, its massive horns snapping as it crashed into the ropey chaos below, letting the mercenaries scream for help before it went limp. Jonathan dives into the dark forest where the beast is locked in a corner, shouting sharply to find a weapon ready. Several dangerous mercenaries sprint into the open and lock onto their blades as they charge toward the enemy. A lone mercenary plunges his spear down through the nets, slicing into Mad Skull with forceful precision. The dark beast in the cage opens its jaw so wide that a scream of pure panic echoes from inside, sending shockwaves through every corner of the room, while Mad Skull roars out with venomous teeth. The mercenaries pulled hard on the ropes to pull Mad Skull's body up tight against her chest. The Mad Skull shrieks with every second he has to crawl through that tight net, while a group of mercenaries pulls on the rope and gets stuck in place again. Jean stares at the signs, saying something isn't okay, and shakes his head in disappointment before turning to go. He stood frozen before the massive, horned beast that was tearing at its own safety net, while soldiers pulled on tight ropes just to keep it from crashing through. Several men are being dragged across the floor while wrestling to tighten their net, and one man finally breaks free with an exasperated shout about how many people are waiting to be caught by a monster. A jagged piece of metal crashes from the top, shattering the ceiling net with a deafening crack. Mad Skull's blazing red eye burns fiercely as it tears through the net, unleashing a violent shockwave that knocks out several mercenaries, sending them tumbling to the ground before they escape from this deadly trap. Seeing Mad Skull rush toward her, she flinches and reaches out with a bright hand to catch herself before she loses control of her voice. Claire runs forward while Jean watches from the side. Claire's arm swings wildly to block Mad Skull's head from slamming into Jean. He swung his heavy boot down to strike a wild Mad Skull's tusk, feeling the impact crush him as he pushed it violently into the dirt. The skull lets out a sharp yelp as the glow of red eyes inches into his own face before snapping back in. Claire suddenly lunges forward and yells, "You're doing this to me, aren't you? It's absolutely dangerous." Jean looks forward with an anxious look while his words are clear, "Don't worry," and then Mad Skull, who has bright red eyes and sharp teeth flashing back at him, replies that he is ready to handle the trouble. The girl stared straight ahead, her face lit up by the bright red glow of her eyes and a dazzling smile that cut through the darkness. He pulls back the metal guards around his mouth and pushes the heavy skull of Mad Skull with all his might, trying to push his own teeth away from his face while he holds on tight for a second. The air suddenly shifts as Jean lets go of his grip and turns his entire frame into a sharp turn toward the corner of the room. His trembling hand instinctively grabs the heavy blade resting against his own back before Mad Skull's terrifying grin finally surfaces beside him. Jean tightens his grip on the heavy blade in his palms before snapping back into place and looking ready for battle. The blade flies through the air, sending a jolt of pain straight to Mad Skull's skull as he tries desperately to brace himself for impact. He lets out a sharp breath of relief, feeling the weight lift from his shoulders while clenching the hilt of his sword so hard he feels it shaking on the floor beneath him. Mad Skull roared forward with his mouth wide open, showing its fierce fangs and sharp tusks while the wind screamed around him as he unleashed incredible raw power. He turned his head like a startled cat, his wide eyes widening as he slowly realized he had let his guard down. His dark eyes widen at the sight of swirling green energy, feathers drifting from a cloud above him. He stumbles back as the chaotic energy hits his face, staring wide-eyed at what he just witnessed. The sky turns a vibrant shade of green as the Mad Skull swoops down on his friend, while Claire leaps to her feet to join the fray for her own protection. Jean watched the swirling energy dance around him and whispered that suddenly his entire body felt as though he had released a massive load of weight. He giggles a little bit as the green energy keeps flowing through him and whispers, "I think I'll just get there easier now." Several men sprint forward clutching guns while shouting that they'll rescue everyone and turning away from the crowd, where Jonathan stares impassively at their desperate run with his mouth wide open in shock. Jin lets the swirling green energy from her skin dance in place while she pulls back to speak, for now, before darting toward Mad Skull and leaving a trail of green energy behind as she says, "It's easy." He rushes forward across the floor while clutching his sword and saying, "To find a Mad Skull, you just need a few basic things. Mad Skull lets out a roar and turns toward the sky, his bright red eyes blazing as he charges down the track at lightning speed. He sees Mad Skull charging directly at him with his eyes wide open, while he shouts, "Turning is so hard," because he knows the enemy will try to stop him now. As Jean rockets up toward the monster, green energy swirls in a perfect circle right around him. The Mad Skull shatters through the falling rock and dust, vanishing into darkness while moving deeper underground. The sharp claws of the foot crash against the hard earth, shattering the tiny patch of dirt that lies just above the soil. As the Mad Skull's jagged skin rips through the earth, rocks and dust fly into the air like a storm of chaos. He hangs in the air, looking down, green energy swirling around him while feathers dance about, and he shouts, "This is the magic of the buff. It's fighting harder right now to pursue him." Then he raises a hand near the creature's face, saying his tusks are as long as swords and work like hands. He swings his sword so high it hits the ceiling before the beast even sees him, then dashes forward, aiming directly at the creature's snout with a determined look in his eyes. The blood rages hotly from the creature's face as it screams loudly. Mad Skull roars and thrashes as blood sprays while the pain intensifies with every movement, leaving it staggered and too burdened to continue attacking. He flips downward midair with his sword gripped in both hands as green energy and feathers spiral around him while he descends. As blood erupted from the monster's flesh and a jagged blade snipped across its face, the scene was instantly chaotic and vivid. The beast howled and flew high, while more blood splashed out of its mouth as it stumbled forward in a panic. The tall monster lunges toward him, but he cuts through the air with a sword below its massive body, causing the blood to splash up and stalling the beast's next move. With a wild grin, he walks toward the door while a shower of red drops flies off from the blood on his clothes. As a crowd bursts through a massive stone wall filled with ancient weapons, the wind carries a thick blanket of dust that hangs low in the air. Two strangers stand amidst a sea of shattered debris and ruins, holding their breath while one wonders how far the tragedy has gone and the other rushes to retrieve the missing hero. As Claire and Jonathan stared at each other with wide, curious eyes, a sleek black SUV lurched through the road ahead, leaving the two drivers stunned by its sudden appearance. Mutt drops his weight low while his teeth lock onto each other as he roars like a storm cloud trying to break through the sky. Claire stares out the window wide-eyed as Jonathan grips her tight and watches her go through a moment of pure, unadulterated shock. Mutt yells out loud while his mouth drops wide open as he turns his head back, causing Claire to stand up behind him and ask, "Did you hear?" Jean walks confidently up a hill as Mutt watches him, with everyone gathered in front of him to watch from behind. Jean watches helplessly while someone screams in disbelief as they try to explain how they've returned from a nightmare, staring at the giant, unresponsive head for confirmation. The group stares at Jean as he calmly declares that there's no more Mad Skull, to which Jonathan replies with a confused look of surprise. The skeleton of a dead madman rises in front of Mutt, who sees only what lies beneath his clothes: whole pigs. A large crowd gathered tightly around Jean as they cheered that they were absolutely amazed by what the lone actor had done, wondering if they had ever seen anyone else crush a Mad Skull alone before now. A cat tilts its head up while letting its mouth slightly open to let out a soft, rumbling whistle as if thinking about the stars. The bear growled loudly as it pushed against the wall, causing Jonathan to flinch when he looked at him with wide eyes. A second Mad Skull steps out of the darkness, holding a flashlight that illuminates its glowing red eyes as it faces straight ahead with a low, determined posture. He grabs the heavy staff and barks, "It's a Mad Skull. Everyone gets ready." She takes a step forward and raises her hand so she can tell him to wait for a while longer. Mad Skull lowered its head gently next to the tiny piglets while revealing they were his own. The two little piglets are standing close together while their eyes lock onto the horizon as they begin to giggle loudly. The giant grin stretches across the face while its mouth closes tight in a deep snort. The massive skull lets out a low growl that shakes everything beneath it. Jean looks straight ahead as the creature next to him lets out a roar that shakes the air around them. The tall monster, Mad Skull, sits right at the entrance of the dark tunnel, lowering his massive head so he can look down safely as the little pigs crawl along beside him. The group stood staring at the Mad Skull as it stayed right in front of them, and a voice was shouting that everyone was going away. Jonathan holds his spear low as Claire stares him down with a worried look, telling him that the monster has already decided to bring up her kids and that she really hates what's happening. Jean looks over at the window, his heart skipping a beat as he hears that soft, peaceful sound echoing out in the quiet house. The quiet city street stretches beneath the vast, glittering blue of a full moon, where we know this landmark is called the Fifth Pioneer City, hidden away among the stars. The quiet street is lined with an old wooden house that has its own warm glow from inside, its heavy door shut behind it while a bright sign hangs lazily by the window above. Jonathan spreads his arms wide on the table while the crowd cheers, praising everyone who finished their job without any serious hurt and smiling that they finally caught the Mad Skull. With a confident grin, he reaches out and points to the ground while shouting, "It's time for settlement." Many men gathered at the table raise their hands and scream with joy while food and drinks rest on the table ready for them. Claire sits at the table clutching her bag as Jean leans against the wall behind her and gestures nervously toward the prize that seems too much for her to accept. He's sitting at the table with a big gold coin in his pocket, but when someone asks why he's so excited about it, he just keeps giggling and pretending nothing else matters. He was explaining that two large, grotesque skulls and piglets had appeared, and since they were way too tough for him to handle, he insisted on a much larger payout for their service. Jonathan spread his arms wide behind the piles of gold and shouted that the prize was 1,000 gold coins, and everyone else cheered for him. Jean stood with his arms crossed, staring at Jonathan, who looked hesitant about the strange news that the couple had finally gotten the money back without ever fighting their mother. Jonathan pauses for a beat by keeping his hand behind his head as he whispers the secret word. The two guys are laughing out loud while giving a thumbs up, saying the joke about being their captain's truth, but if your luck doesn't tip the scales in their favor, they'll never know it was real. Jean sits with his hands up and sighs loud while calling out these fascinating individuals. A hand pulls back from behind, turning the boy's head to look at him, while Jonathan speaks up with a loud shout. Jonathan grips Jean's arm as he pauses, whispering, "I'm thinking of splitting this profit share with you. Are you okay?" Jean pauses, eyes widening as he repeats half of the sentence aloud, his surprise clearly visible in that wide stare. Jonas took a deep breath and smiled kindly as he told Jonathan that his heart wouldn't even care if things went wrong. The boy just wanted to be happy, so he accepted the news with a warm grin. He keeps his hand on Jin's shoulder as he faces the group, shouting that splitting the increased reward for everyone was exactly what they wanted. Meanwhile, two men sat at the table, smiling in unison, one giving a thumbs up and laughing, while another raised the mug beside him. As Jean touched his face to look ahead, he realized that having both the buff and the trap work together was exactly what he needed for today's adventure. The cup of foam cups his lips while whispering that some people are simply not worth my time. As Jean lifts a tall mug and Jonathan swings his arm hard, they erupt into loud cheers as barrels fall from above and dozens of people rush to gulp down the drinks in heavy gulps. Jean watches his friend pass by with the mugs in hand, turning his gaze to see where Claire is going next. Claire steps toward the door, clutching a bag while Jean shouts, "Practice magic!" As she turns around, a bright full moon hangs low above the dark street, casting a soft blue glow over her as she sits in a field of trees with her eyes closed. Claire slouched across the floor with her gaze locked shut while a stream of soft blue light drifted up from her feet, wrapping gently around her legs. Jean stands with his arms crossed, leaning against the tree to watch her, whispering as he realizes she's clearly exhausted from a long hunt. Claire sits quietly while Jean stares intently at her, and she whispers, "Magic," before thinking it over. Claire pauses at the storage bin to see who's there, holding onto that giant rolled-up net before turning to ask Jean about teaching magic. Claire leaned back against the crates, her hands resting casually on the crate while Jean stood by watching her, feeling a strong sense of relief as if he had finally solved the puzzle for her. He said it all so clearly that she felt her heart soar with gratitude, realizing how much he had saved her in such a frightening moment. Claire stood facing Jean, holding her hips up, and said, "I'd refuse to let this mercenary group teach my students without protecting them first." He leans forward with a wide grin and points toward the door as he declares, "Magic won't teach itself, so let's go home in 2 days." Claire stares at the man with a firm look while he giggles, then asks why an all-powerful hunter would let such a tough mercenary join them. Jonathan placed his hand gently on Jin's shoulder while closing his eyes, whispering the truth that a brave wolf almost always prefers to stay by itself, which makes him feel incredibly safe right now as they travel together. A quiet family member sits quietly while his father looks at him with a blank face, feeling squeezed out of everything. Jean stands right by Jonathan and Claire, asking what's next for them, while Jonathan holds up both hands to show that they're going to the fourth major city with lots of work ahead. Jean looks up and nods, saying, "We were already thinking of going to that place. I'd be happy to follow along." Jean had to pull back his large, heavy roll of net when he awkwardly declared he was ready for spells like magic, but Jonathan and Claire both smiled brightly, giving glowing thumbs up as the trio noted that Jean really wasn't a liar and seemed pretty good at it. It turns out Jonathan has wrapped his arm tightly around Jean, who lets out a wide grin as he reveals the truth. The relationship isn't just luck, it's a real friendship built on trust. As Jean smiles faintly while thinking about where he's heading, the future seems already locked in his mind like a sealed door. The giant armored beast marches down the dirt road, hauling a heavy structure behind it as many civilians walk past in the background. The giant beast leaps up and screams as humanity finally recognizes that they have found their mythical tur, the beast crafted specifically to carry them safely through the world. Jean pauses by the giant beast in his heavy sack and lifts his head to see how big it really is, noting its job as an amazing pack animal. As Jonathan walks forward carrying a heavy bag, he points at the road ahead while whispering that there's still miles to cover before they can finally move. Jean lies cross-legged beneath the moonlight while Claire watches beside him, both eyes shut as they concentrate on a hard-to-master lesson. Jin stared blankly at the mirror while tears streamed down his tired face. Learning felt like a mountain of stairs, but the hardest climb was just staring in front of him again. Claire stares at Jean's glowing blue orb, which seems to pulse softly as he speaks about the secret that some things can only be truly grown by doing them over and over again. Jean pauses in mid-speech, wincing as sweat bead from his forehead because he's struggling to say a single word about what just happened. Jean sat beneath the dark stars, watching as Claire pointed out the edge of his darkness, knowing that he had survived 12 years battling demons in a place where every shadow was a wound. Jean sat cross-legged by the moonlight, watching a cascade of falling leaves dance around him in quiet wonder. As Jean squinted open his lids, a soft, pale blue light streamed gently toward him from the shadows around him, drawing his focus inward with just one glance. As a tiny blue spark rises into the air, he catches its sight of that feeling for the first time in his life. Claire claps her hands and leans forward with excitement as she says he succeeded in feeling the magic, and Jean turns his head to ask if it was all true. He looked ahead with a shy smile as he told everyone the miracle of feeling magic had only lasted 10 days, describing how hard things were in trying to get one's way. She sits quietly next to him, clutching her knees tight like she's holding on to the best part of his story, while laughing softly at how the others just can't hear the magic even when it's there. Claire rushes forward from her pouch and grabs the tiny bottle before saying that's all for now. The glass artist tilts the bottle gently, letting the shimmering blue liquid ripple through the shallow dish in a way that feels like magic is happening just right. Claire lifts her hand slowly while staring at Jean with a calm tone. You need to get out. As if something was wrong, Jean stared into the flashbulb behind her and felt something hot rise in his neck before he caught it. A gentle breeze carries leaves drifting lazily under a brilliant moonbeam across the quiet night sky. She lets out a soft sigh while the blue drop drops down her finger, causing Jean to look up with wide eyes. Claire pushes her gloved hand against his back, and a glowing magic circle sprays across his skin, weaving intricate patterns and lines into the fabric of his body. She calmly describes how she can draw mana directly into his cells with this tool, building a sacred path for him to traverse. The spell fully envelopes his entire back as she concludes by instructing him that she is about to begin injecting mana, urging him to focus intently so he may feel the energy flowing through his skin carefully and with purpose. Jean shrugs, opens his eyes, and whispers a soft reply as the world fades away behind him. In a flash of white light, the glowing orb instantly pops into existence and bursts with energy. Blue magic floods him, lighting up the whole thing like a magical storm. Jean feels like he's being pulled into a very strange kind of heat when the moonlight hits him, and his muscles start to tighten so hard that it makes him almost feel something totally new about what he's experiencing right now. As deep as he goes, the glowing light starts to split and branch out all over him, just like veins in a big river, and it makes his heart beat louder. Claire watches from behind as he reaches out to ask if he can feel the mana, while Jean steadies himself and replies with a vivid sense of flow moving through him. Claire slowly lets go of her eyelids as she whispers gently about how magic is like a journey with 3 important steps along the way. The glowing light flickers on as an ancient spirit guides you to a magical circle, whispering that understanding begins with feeling mana before storing it for your use. Claire puts her hand on her heart as she watches the clock tick toward the next stage, ready to face whatever comes next. The girl lies still, her hand over her mouth so no words escape her lips as blue light wraps around her like a protective cloak. He closes his eyes and lets out a breath that feels heavy, then pulls on his lips so the sweat doesn't fall off yet before he starts to hold onto the energy inside him like an anchor. Claire rests her hand firmly on the man's back while a brilliant wave of blue energy erupts around them, and then she begins to speak. A magical glow dances across Jin's spine while bright blue light shoots up like a storm around her. Suddenly, an ugly, insect-sized monster bolts up the back of another giant beast, and its brilliant glow pops out right in front of the darkness. The giant bug with flashing lights lunges down and grabs the monstrous beast by the throat as it stretches out its arms wide against a backdrop of swirling, blood-splattered darkness. It suddenly jerks forward like a giant snake, revealing its twisted spine and powerful legs as the world turns around. The creature's wings and belly are stretched wide apart while its back arches upward into a dramatic, almost twisted stance. A swarm of red, glowing eyes clings tightly to the center of his head, forcing him to face every direction in front of him. Claire's wide eyes snap shut as a cloud of sweat coats her face, leaving her staring blankly at the terrifying force pressing against her. As if a sudden current of blue light was rushing by beside her, she snapped her head back and turned sharply away from that invisible force. Jin grabs the edges of her skirt and pushes them backward against his waist, while a thick, twisting cloud of dark purple magic swirls violently around him before finally pulling him down to the ground. She freezes in horror when she sees a flash of red light on the floor. Her mana has been sucked away from her, and she knows exactly what to do next. A sleek tail curls tightly over Claire's back as she violently kicks backward in response to the strike. Claire floats in midair with mud, lifting her up by her tail, while blue energy paints invisible trails all over her form, and Jin lies on his back inside the thick, swirling mist that wraps around them. As the red wolf lowered Claire to the floor, she landed on her feet and stared at him with a wide-eyed shock. The red wolf drops its chin low while the light shines through those piercing, glowing eyes. Claire stared out the window and felt a sudden chill run down her face because the rain looked like it was coming to help her. As Jin walks forward while raising one arm, he shouts sharply at the woman beside him. As he gently pulls her hand, he whispers, "Are you okay?" Climbing high, Claire stares out at the dark sky where her friend's mind is dancing with impossible colors, while cold sweat stirs on her skin like a storm before it stops. In the deepening shadows, a mysterious dark insect-like creature with burning red eyes rises over twisted ground as humanity's power and nature begin to weave into this new reality. A vast sea of glowing red eyes stretches across the darkness, reflecting how the person's mental world shifts depending on their own life story. A mysterious figure wearing nothing but clothes stands alone in a pitch-black void where giant, terrifying eyes watch over him from above, creating a scene of pure danger. Claire leans closer to Jin as he rests his hands on the dirt, asking him to tell me everything without hiding a single word. Claire crosses her arms as she waits for Jin to finish eating that big piece of meat. Jin turns toward her and whispers, "What kind of center are you talking about?" The crystal core glows in the air while she describes how it was hidden inside the beast, and Jin replies with a laugh when he discovers the monster's blood beneath his skin. Claire yanks Jin tightly across his chest and erupts into a screeching yell of horror, screaming to find out exactly how much internal matter he consumed. Claire stared hard forward, her cheeks all bunched with a heavy layer of sweat as she watched Jin eat through internal cores while hunting monsters for 10 years, or perhaps even more, just to keep going. As Jin pats his head with a sigh, he asks Claire if something is wrong, and she immediately bursts into shouting about it altogether. She drops her voice to whisper about the terrifying truth. Eating an internal core means Claire stares down at you and chooses between your life being taken away or becoming a monstrous creature. As a single eye flashes bright red in the glow of moonlight, Jin tilts his head upward while another side of him seems to lean into the scene. The forest floor is cold and quiet, but the air smells faintly of blood near where the deer sits atop the dead animal. She speaks softly to her companion, her voice barely audible over the low hum of nature, while someone else watches with a strange sense of judgment over the scene unfolding before them. The deer, whose glowing blue eyes dart about while a dark red tongue brushes its lips, sits in the deep woods where karma is the dark energy that drains life from demons and lets them summon strange powers in their own skin. The giant deer lets out a thunderous roar, and suddenly, the strange shape that was once just a small lump of dirt in its belly begins to spin rapidly like a dying star, turning into a terrifyingly large monster core made entirely out of spinning memories. Claire stands close to the tree-line, watching as Jin and Jonathan wander along the woods. She stares intensely and whispers that something strange feels wrong. Then a dark figure suddenly emerges from nowhere, while the ancient gates of fate finally open up. As a cloaked figure lifts his arm, A cascade of frosty matter erupt from his side, leaving behind a group of people who have joined the demons seeking to become gods by absorbing all their sins. A towering beast of bone and blood towers above the human altar, where demons and their kind devour the holy core and sacrifice the living, turning innocent souls into madness. A brave hunter stands tall as Jean says, "I've been eating those monsters since I first started." He keeps eating them every day, perhaps even millions of times over his 10-year journey to the dark. Claire stares into that dark room, filled with a cloud of red eyes, realizing that her friend Jean has consumed all the monster cores in his life, and wondering how much more time he can wait before becoming a dark priest. As Claire drops her head, Jean stands silently beside her, holding a question mark on his own head, while she finishes thinking that he isn't a dark priest because he wouldn't admit to eating monster cores or display his inner thoughts. Claire steps back, watching Jean swing his sword to slice through the purple creature while clutching a core of monster meat in his hand. Jean grabs the bloody monster with one trembling hand, watching blood ooze like a living thing from the wound on its arm. Claire shut her eyes as Jean stood right beside her, staring down at that awful food they were about to devour. Claire folds her arms and watches Jean chew beside her, thinking he might be a true mystery and wondering exactly what he's eating when they see all the other monsters devouring their own core food. Jean had to look down at her when she spoke about the monster cores. He knew he'd only survived this much time and couldn't actually live anymore. So she leaned in close with that serious expression as if he was going to be killed every moment she told him. Jean pauses at his chin, staring blankly as the words "eating monster" and "monster core" seem to strike him with sudden, terrifying force. He doesn't believe them. He knows exactly how to turn a normal person into a monster, but he looks out the window, wondering if this might be a lie he has been told all along. Jean stares into the future, his face set in a quiet curiosity as he wonders why feeling so empty after killing everyone feels like a curse from a giant, never-ending core. The monster's glowing core flickers beneath its dark eye, making Jinsai wonder hard before seeing what lies in that light. Jean slams his heavy sack onto the floor and chews it with a loud clack before whispering to Claire, "Hey, we need to stop eating those monsters." Claire stood behind Jean, arms crossed, warning him, "If you keep swallowing monster cores, your life's ending depends on it and you won't even get a chance to cast a spell." Then Jean's eyes widened as he stared at her, surprised by the threat. Jean turns around and whispers, "I'm not going to use magic," as Claire smiles sadly because her own life is far less precious than yours. Claire lets out a long breath and whispers calmly, "All right, now I know exactly what's going on. Don't panic. The power is just waiting to show up." Claire raises one finger and tells us he must still have the chance to wield magic. Jean looks up as he realizes the world has magic, so he asks everyone in the room to tell him what kind of mana arts they have. The fourth pioneer city boasts an imposing tower that pierces over its neighbors. The crowd gathers under that towering column crowned by a winged statue while cool water gushes out of the nearby fountain, creating a lively scene at night. Jean watches as the massive group gathers on the crowded plaza, while Claire and Jonathan stand right behind him, whispering that they can't be surprised because this task is so big that even a silver-haired knight with armor before them would have to wait for the very first Holy Knight to see what's coming. Holy Knight, Raymond steps forward wearing complete armor and holding a long sword beside him. Jean glances back while Claire beams of warmth beside him, just as the Holy Knight stares down with a gaze so powerful it feels like a shield against all other men. The knight's eyes are locked on Jean, sensing an intense aura that doesn't seem to belong to anyone else. The mysterious Jean stares down at Claire, wondering how often this special group of heroes actually meets up while the Golden Bug Wolf is leading the pack. Jean stared at Claire with a wicked grin as he asked her if the Golden Bug was an insect-type monster, but she shook his head and asked why he didn't even know about it. Jean looks at the prey with wide eyes and a bewildered face while she announces that he truly has no idea what hunting entails at all. Jean walks side to side with Jonathan and Claire, leaning back against their backs while shouting that the Golden Bug was the real businessman and one of the world's wealthiest tycoons. Jonathan lowered his eyes as he watched the Golden Bug vanish in a moment of sudden death. Jean walks beside Jonathan as he looks for evidence of the Golden Bug's death, while Jonathan replies, "There are rumors all along, but not a single fact." Jean watches the excited crowd as he sees the Golden Bug's ghostly signal, wondering why everyone else is gathering right now when the creature seems to be fading away. Then, walking beside him, Jonathan reveals that the Golden Bug isn't dead at all. It has two beautiful sons who are making the most of their current moment. Two powerful sons sit side by side with a wall of shining treasures right in front of them, forcing the man standing behind him to push their wealth out through that solid barrier. Jean steps forward into the quiet room of his wealthy friend, who seems to have been waiting for him alone, while many people gather around watching with wide eyes. Claire and Jonathan are standing right next to Jean, who has begun to tense up as that mysterious voice calls out for him to move toward his team. He hurled himself through the throng with a roar of determination, demanding that everyone follow his lead before they ever let go. Jean leans in to watch Jean stand right next to him as he presents him, holding up the man he just saved from a savage skull and guiding a dangerous werewolf away with his own strength. A sudden gust of wind swept Jean's hair back, and as his sweaty face flushed to a vivid red, the crowd gathered around him, gasping for air while they whispered about being his rival head crusher who didn't really hold up under the pressure. The guy who thinks he can fix his life by ignoring the mess in front of him. Jonathan is leaning against Jean as he watches Jean look uncertain, and Jean whispers gently, "Stop, don't worry, everything will be fine." The silver-haired holy knight Raymond watches calmly as he turns his gaze toward the horizon. Jean and Jonathan are standing right there before the request board, where Ray shouts that the Black Marlin mercenary team will get 100 gold coins and has to leave soon after the sun rises. Jonathan tightens his grip and yells, "Everyone get moving!" Meanwhile, Jean lifts his hand to his side, declaring that he's got to pay the extra 100 gold coins just so the suitcase can slide off him. He beams with pride and raises his hand as he explains, "Half the money belongs to the workers' wages, and the other half covers the rent." Jean watches Jonathan praise the deal because Jin is such a powerful name, even though her boss crushes on him. Jonah watches Jean as he laughs, realizing that head crusher isn't just a name. It's a joke for an image showing Jean crushing someone else's head. Jean takes a deep breath and sighs deeply before speaking. Everyone who got that nickname had a terrible sense for names. Jonathan steps right next to Jean with a sack on, and he points out that collecting 100 gold coins is like winning the jackpot. While Jean walks silently beside him, he looks forward with a serious expression and adds, "This level of fame will help me learn the art of mana." Under a beautiful moonlit sky, a massive building glows with warm light in its many windows, clearly marking it as the safe area for the mercenaries. In the center of the ring, a fierce fight rages between two men as dozens of fans shout in their ears for one to strike and warn the other from running away. A fighter's fist slammed into the other guy's face, snapping him backward from the hit. Claire walks up to the edge of the arena railing, wondering if Jean is ready for another round when a champion lifts their fists high in triumph, and Jean quickly places sterile gauze over his gloved hands. Jean pulls back the top bandage on his hand and whispers that he intends to teach his students new spells while Claire stands by, staring with a worried look at the danger. Jean stands deep within the wooden arena, carefully adjusting the bandages around his injured arm as he watches a story unfold about how some ancient knights became fascinated just by seeing a mighty man. Ryman stares intently at the page while the book describes how admitting strength gives the other person better care. Jean watches the arena as he faces off against his enemy, knowing that the fight ahead won't be easy either. Jean glances at the crowd and whispers, "We all get hurt in this fight, because I'm going to make sure they know who the Holy Knight is." Then he punches right into Jin's face and shouts, "That was my first blow." Oh no! The enemy swung their arm across the field right as Jin was about to turn her head away from the hit, and a fresh tear rolled down her cheek while she watched it fall onto the grass. Jin's fist slammed into the man's face, sending blood splashing out like water as he jerked his head back violently. Jean grabs the opponent's head while his own body shudders violently as they recoil together. The crowd erupts as Jean forces his head forward into the enemy's face, while their body spins wildly in the air behind him. As Raymond lifts his mug to sip, Jean watches him intently before swinging a powerful punch at an unsuspecting foe and immediately thinking that mere staring isn't enough. He knows the true beginning of this fight must now begin. The Holy Knight takes a deep breath before kicking his way through the crowd with a powerful spin that sends an angry fighter flying into the air, leaving the ground trembling behind him. He tried to thrust his knee toward the other man before realizing he'd lost a fight and was just about to lose again, not knowing that knocking one guy down in half arms could knock him out too. Raymond stands at the balcony railing watching the arena as Jean wonders if the mysterious Holy Knight has actually been there, wondering exactly why someone else would be coming from his own place. The massive fighter named Jean leans forward over a pile of defeated allies who are screaming in agony as he watches them go down, feeling every last blow while he stares blankly at the sky above them. Jean watches Raymond and the red-haired knight look out at the balcony as they decide how to act if they are supposed to be knights but aren't. Rex turns around to see Raymond's face as he points at a red-haired knight and says, "Fight him." Rex stares wide-eyed as the captain tells him to fight a mere mercenary. Jean watches Raymond and Rex staring into space because suddenly, That quiet silence where they used to sit is exactly what starts their adventures. He stares ahead with a quiet smile as Jean tells everyone the secret begins when they finally negotiate to master new mana skills. Rex stares forward with widened eyes and reacts in.